My name is Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, and
I'm Katherine Stewart.
And we're delighted to have this conversation. Those of you who are here, I think, understand something of what we mean when we say Christian nationalism. It's certainly an ideology, a belief, a movement that is misusing faith, I believe, to undermine democracy in our country, and a conversation that we both really believe needs to be happening in our country right now, but especially in churches, since this movement has so consciously grabbed onto the language of Christian churches. America was founded as a Christian nation, and that somehow Christians, in particular white Christian men, being in control of the country is tied up with its destiny. But it's not just an ideology, it's also a movement, an organizational gathering of groups and people who are working towards a particular agenda. And all that's true, and that's kind of the descriptive language that sociologists use and journalists use, but this is also something that we know because we've seen it, we've experienced it. So we thought we would start just by talking to one another about how we encountered this movement. So I'll say on Katherine's behalf that we have here with us one of the most well-informed journalists on this movement in the world. She's studied it closely for over a decade now, has reported all over the place. I'm sure some of you have read her stuff in the New York Times and other places. She has a great book on this called The Power Worshippers. But before all that, you were someone who bumped into this. How did you get into this?
That's right, and thank you so much for that terrific introduction. I first encountered this movement through an experience with my own daughter's public elementary school. I was living in Santa Barbara, and our daughter was about 6 years old, and I learned that a Good News Club was coming to our school. Now, Good News Clubs are after-school clubs that target children in public elementary schools, kids who are in their earliest years of learning, too young to read in many instances. The centerpiece of their program is called the Wordless Book. It's got no words, just pictures and shapes and colors. And it gives these kids the message that without conforming to the religion of the club and its sponsoring organization, they will go to hell, they'll be separated from God forever. And the clubs encourage these kids to recruit their peers to the club. They give them points, prizes, sometimes candy for doing this. Little kids are like, public schools have a cloak of authority in their minds. They can't distinguish between an activity that takes place in their school and one sponsored by their school. They think if it's happening in their school, it's what their school wants them to believe. Now, in our own community, I could see how kids attending the clubs were starting to target their non-Christian peers or their Catholic peers or kids attending the so-called wrong kinds of churches for what I could only describe as faith-based bullying and bigotry. And a lot of the parents were really upset about the arrival of the club in our public school. They were, felt disillusioned, alienated from the whole school itself. And the Good News Club leaders, they were offered by a group of evangelical parents who actually didn't want the Good News Club coming to our school. They were offered free and better space in an evangelical church next door to the school, and they declined. And I just started...
They really wanted to be in the public school.
They wanted to be in the public school. They didn't want to be in the evangelical church that was like, I don't know how many, 40 yards away. So at the same time, for free. It's an absolutely beautiful church. So that really tipped me off. I thought, what do these evangelical parents at my school know about this club that I don't know? And why do they insist on being in the public school when all this other space is available to them? What do they really believe? And above all, how is this legal and constitutional given our separation of church and state? So I really started learning about the club, and I attended their national convention. I went to Good News Clubs around the country. And I discovered the things that really astonished me was the hostility to public education among Good News Club leaders. They called our public schools scenes of spiritual battle. They called them government schools. They called our children the harvest and our schools mission fields. And that contempt for education, I recognize that as Good News Clubs as being just one small part of a broader attack on public education, and the attack on public education as just one part of a broader attack on America as a constitutional democracy. So that's really what got me started in this movement. But I'd love to hear about how you got started in the movement, your way into this area.
So, really interesting part of your story to me is that from the time you encountered this phenomenon of Christian nationalism, you were engaged with Christians, neighbors who were Christian, who thought it was a bad idea.
Exactly.
Right? So this
all of my friends at the, in our daughter's public elementary school were affiliated with Westmont College, and they're the group that met with the Good News Club leaders and said, "You're not right for our school.
Yeah.
We too, are, Christians and, evangelicals, but they arranged for that free space."
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for me, I grew up in a rural context in the Baptist church where I think most Christians didn't realize that this was an organized movement. But as it happens, and as I understand now, I was growing up right at the time when they were really targeting our community. And so without realizing it, I think many people in my circle of folks who frankly loved me well and wanted the best for me sort of started connecting me to things that I now know are part of this movement. And that led me as a young person to think that I really needed to be a politician for Jesus, and that meant being a very conservative Republican politician. My people had raised me to value that and to do all that I could, for the Lord. So I set off to do that. And in the course of trying to pursue that path, I ended up working as a teenager on Capitol Hill for Senator Strom Thurmond, and was there in the Senate, seeing how all of this worked. And what I began to realize was that there was just a basic contradiction between what I had learned in Sunday school and what these folks were about, what they were pursuing, and the way they were pursuing it in public life. So that, for me, became this tension that I think you were articulating there in the community between these people who are claiming Christianity and claiming Christian values for a particular agenda, and other people who, also know those texts, who also affirm that tradition, but who see a very different application of it in the world. And that has led to my growing concern about how this movement continues to consolidate power and try to take over and to essentially be a movement that can orchestrate minority rule in the United States.
It's very interesting what you're saying about your experience, because this is a movement that promotes division. America is really divided as never before, perhaps not ever, but in our history, recent history, I should say, certainly in my lifetime. And I saw that in our school community. The arrival of the club provoked enormous division. And the astonishing thing was that the leaders of the Good News Club, rather than seeing this as an unintended consequence of their activity, they actually seemed to welcome it. And but we are seeing a kind of division in our country. We're seeing it in our families, we're seeing it in our communities. Yeah. And we're seeing it, I think a lot of faith communities are seeing it as well. And that's very concerning, because it makes it harder for us to tackle some of the real problems that we face as a country.
I think that's probably a manifestation of this movement that almost everyone has experienced. Can I get an amen? So, as a journalist, you dug in and started looking at, where is this coming from? How does this work? Maybe all of us have experienced, to some degree, this increase in division, this increase in the use of, language of, the enemy is Satan, our side is God's side. But when you dig in, you learn a lot about where it's coming from. So, yeah, tell us, I mean, it's hard to summarize, I'm sure, all that you've reported, but some of what you've seen in terms of what has led us to this, what's behind the scenes?
Well, I think of Christian nationalism as two things. It's a set of ideas, an ideology. But that ideology is a tool, the most useful tool for a leadership-driven movement that is like organizing this political movement, driving support for this political movement. And the movement it's leadership-driven, but it's also organization-driven. The strength of this movement is in that dense organizational infrastructure that's been built up over decades. And we can divide, I think, the organizations into different categories. I'm going to throw out some names. This is by no means comprehensive. But for instance, there are right-wing policy groups such as the Family Research Council or the American Family Association. There are think tanks such as Heritage Foundation and its activist arm, Heritage Action, or the Manhattan Institute. There's a vast sort of legal sphere which consists of legal advocacy groups such as the Alliance Defending Freedom, which had fiscal year 2020-2021 $102 million budget. And that is only one of many other organizations, including First Liberty Council, Pacific Justice Institute, and others. There are networking organizations such as the Council for National Policy, which brings together different leaders of different organizational factions and sort of gets them all on the same page and sets out the agenda in many instances. You also have legislative initiatives, education initiatives that promote the sort of deep story of the Christian nationalist myth. And there are very sophisticated data initiatives. The movement also operates through a lot of pastoral organizations, which I'd be happy to describe later. But what I want to say is that this movement, the source of its strength is really its unity. The leadership cadre often work through multiple organizations and sometimes jump from organization to organization. But it's as strong as it is because it's like this machine has been built up over decades. Now, is every employee of all of these organizations, could they be described as a Christian nationalist? Absolutely not. But the point is, the Christian nationalism is more than like an ideology embraced by millions of supporters. It's almost like a political dysfunction, I would call it, that afflicts political systems. And I think sometimes it's easier to recognize when we see it happening in other countries. So if you're looking at say Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or leaders in Iran, when these leaders are binding themselves very tightly to reactionary religious figures and religious leaders in their own countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. And they do it, frankly, I think these leaders do it in some ways to bubble wrap themselves in sanctimony, to impede or guard against any check on their corruption. The politics they produce tend to be cronyistic, nepotistic, often, sometimes kleptocratic. And we've seen that certainly in our politics today. But I'd be really interested to hear from you about how this dynamic has influenced churches and faith communities.
Yeah, I mean, the organizations that you describe and their kind of unified aims are out there. And I think people see this or that happening A lot of churches, I think for a long time, have tried to keep all of that at an arm's distance. You know, that's not what church is about. But if you're in churches, you see how what happens there trickles in. For example, one of the things we do in churches is we pray. Often we have, smaller group times where people say, "What are your prayer requests?" And you begin to realize, especially if you spend some time listening to what these organizations are promoting, that people have prayer concerns that have been fundamentally shaped by the emails they're getting, from these lists they're on. So pray for our kids in the schools. They're really under attack. It means something to them because they've been told this story about an agenda that's being pushed through public schools that's secularizing kids, this sort of thing. So I think that's one way that it lands in churches. But it's also the case in churches that I think people are experiencing in community the division that these organizations aim to sow. Because that division is based on fear, and that fear is the motivating factor that is going to get a group of people that they know as a minority in the country to show up as a majority in the elections. And so, the same kinds of things that I think people have been experiencing in their families and experiencing at school board meetings and at, other kind of public gatherings and venues in our communities, we're seeing all of that in churches too. Churches where it's increasingly difficult to have conversations about what's happening because people have all these narratives that they're bringing with them. But I think it's helpful to know that that's coming from somewhere. And some of these organizations are the root of that.
That's true. There is a vast messaging sphere that this movement works through. A lot of the machinery sort of taps into that messaging sphere, and they generate grievance. They often create and promote cultural conflict, and sometimes in some aspects of that messaging sphere, they actually promote conspiracism, and that actually makes sort of their target population immune to certain forms of, real information and prone to accepting various types of misinformation, and that makes them easier to control.
Yeah.
If you can persuade people, for instance, that, of some terrible conspiracy involving, one political party or another, you can get them to vote for the opposite political party.
Right.
And if you can get them certainly to vote on 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote.